Okay, well, thanks for having me. It's exciting. I stumbled upon this, maybe Facebook or something, and I think this is a great project.
Thank you.
And I actually was talking, I've been in some conversations, with some people too, that I'm not sure the field is attending to its history very well, and I think this is an important kind of intervention in
Right.
that.
That was the whole point of this.
Yeah,
I had the same feeling, especially like our generation, we really do need to archive who we are.
right.
The last generation, I think we're kind of being eclipsed by their fame and all they've done. And I think we need to make sure that we're not eclipsed by another generation of scholars who made a serious attempt at archiving. And this is a new kind of archiving. And I think it's just as important, to do it this way as it is in text, because this is a form of text.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm excited to be a part of it and really want to support it too, because I agree.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think
who's our Bill Schubert, right?
You.
Right.
I don't know. You.
I don't know.
Maybe this project.
Yeah.
Be a part of that. But I think that the other concern for me is the future, because we have, the Pinar, the Gourmet, the Apple, and all of those people that really rethought education that we still go back to in important ways. And then, the next generation kind of took it out in many different directions, but it lost the sense of a field and of a community. I know that I do a lot of media literacy, and I generally turn to people in communications more than I turn to people in curriculum studies. And so the future of, I think the next generation or our generation has to make it a field again.
Yeah, and then how to do that is an important question. I do think that's what the reconceptualization was, though, right? Was reading widely, broadly, outside of education, and taking those ideas and saying, well, hey, what does this help us do in our work, right? And the questions that we have. And I'll say, maybe a little controversially, just to jump right in, but when I started in the field, I did feel a little bit that some of the senior scholars, there was a little bit of a finger wagging, right? Is that you're not doing it right? And in part, I think it's because I was part of a generation that was doing what we thought the reconceptualists project was, which was reading broadly and reading widely, and we were reading differently than those senior scholars. And I think some of them didn't kind of like why aren't you doing psychoanalysis? Why aren't you doing phenomenology, right? And I felt like we had answers, but it was a little bit of a tension there. But when you've got a field that is really interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and its whole project is seeking out these kind of new avenues and new ideas, you're going to have trouble defining the field, right? I think that's what it is. But I think it's also important that we attend to it, and that there's some stewardship, I think, that's important. And I don't, I'm nervous about this because I feel like it makes me the cranky old man. But I see a lot of more emergent scholars there, and their work is really not citing the field. And so it's one problem to not cite the field. It's another problem to not cite the field and then claim your work is innovative, right? And it might be innovative, or that it's new, right? Mm-hmm. I'm the first to ever think about this stuff. And so I know there's a politics to citations, and it's tricky, and it gets into all kinds of controversies in the field, but I think it's important. And I think it's not to say that you're not making a contribution, but it's pretty important to note the shoulders on which you stand.
Well, Bill Piner wrote that book on disciplinarity for a reason. Yep. And even though people, were like, why are you writing a book on disciplinarity when we're talking about interdisciplinarity? Well, he wrote the book on disciplinarity because we're still trying to define what our discipline is, and the citation issue, I think, is an important one. I mean, it's really difficult to even teach students to how to, you know, connect wherever you're working, whether it's media literacy, or I know you were doing stuff with, correct me if I'm wrong, place and
Mhm.
space and those interesting things. And then you have to tie it back into something that's been done before,
Yeah.
which seems like an easy enough thing to do, but in fact it isn't. So yeah, I think disciplinarity is very important, and that's part of the part of the project of the genealogy is
Yeah.
to
Right.
talk about how we connect the dots here so we
Yeah.
don't lose our field.
Mhm. Well, we're attacked enough from the
Mhm.
outside, people who don't believe in what we do. And it's not like the ideas are going to go anywhere. There will always be these philosophical, historical, sociological ideas. And I think that they'll probably exist in some form interdisciplinary, you know, with people looking at all of them at the same time.
Yeah.
But whether it'll be in curriculum studies is kind of up to us in how we, you know, act as stewards.
Yeah, I agree. But you know, I started teaching a graduate seminar, kind of the one curriculum class that was required in a couple master's programs when, you know, my first position was at Indiana University. And so I kind of inherited, since, oh, it's genealogy. So I inherited the course from Jose Rosario. And, you know, Jose kind of left the field of curriculum, but he's in JCT Volume 1, Issue 1. And he's brilliant. I loved working with him, but he kind of left curriculum, did some different things. But the reason I bring up that course is that teachers, and these were mostly practicing teachers getting a master's degree, you know, post-certification. And there was one curriculum course in there, and they would often take it last. And I found out later that they would take it last because other faculty advisors would tell them that it's terrible and to save it for the end, right? And those were faculty in special ed or more kind of more general teacher ed or literacy or whatever. So one, it was a great class to teach because the students thought it was going to be terrible. So it was kind of like going to see a movie you think isn't going to be any good. If they do anything right, you're thrilled, right?
Mhm.
You know, so there was that, right? But the other thing that I found is the tools that we have in curriculum studies are really, really useful. And it's not that hard to make the case to teachers, educators, administrators, whatever it might be, that these questions, the type of questions that we ask, the type of kind of analysis that we run through is very useful to them. And it's not hard to make the case, right? Now, it's often a little, it's a little bit dramatic, right? And I got to the point where I would tell them on the first night of class, like, you need to know that my underlying objective here is to explode whatever notion you have of what curriculum is in your head. I want to blow it up. And so when you're reading this thing and you're wondering why the hell did he assign this, right? I want you to remember that, right? Because that means I'm doing my job, right? I'm blowing up these kind of two fixed notions of what curriculum is. And I got great evaluations, and I had these teachers writing the dean saying, we need curriculum 2. Where's the second part of the class? And it was legitimate. Like these tools we have, these questions that we ask are useful. And once kind of turning them onto it, I think is powerful. So that's the other thing is I think we can make a case for what we do. You know, I mean, that 1619 project foolishness, recently, I mean, that's a straight up curriculum question. I mean, that's a traditional curriculum question. How do we teach history in schools?
Sure.
Right. And it makes it to the national stage. Right.
That's right. Every time they try to make core standards, it makes it to the national stage. And then, of course, when someone comes up with an alternative history or turns our traditional notion of history on its head, then people get very upset.
Yeah. Yeah. But then, at the national level saying, we need to find the universities that are including critical race theory in their programs of study.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's as curriculum of a project as you can get.
Mhm.
So, but you know, you kind of asked me a question about how I got here. And I think it's kind of relevant if I can slide into that a little bit.
Sure, yeah, that's where I was gonna go.
So I was a very happy high school teacher. Very happy. I was teaching at urban high school, Raleigh, North Carolina. Loved it. I had tenure, so
What
kind of
years
do
were
what
you
I'm.
there?
What's that?
What years were you there?
Let's see. I was at Broughton High School in Raleigh from 96 to 2000.
Okay. I was in Chapel Hill over those years, but anyways.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know if I knew the Chapel Hill connection, Dan. I don't know if I knew.
Yeah.
So I started as a middle school teacher. I went to UNC-Chapel Hill undergrad. Started as a middle school teacher, taught in Apex, North Carolina.
Mhm.
Interesting little getting to, imagine we'll get to space and place at some point, but that was kind of it was farmland. It was tobacco fields that were slowly, not quite gentrifying is not quite the right word, but they were building subdivisions and McMansions actually on these old tobacco fields. So it was a kind of an interesting time to be in Apex. I had students that lived in some of these McMansions. And then I had some students that didn't have running water, right? So that was the early 90s. Then I went up to Appalachian State in Boone, and I did a master's in actually social science. And it was kind of an interesting social science education. It was an interesting program that had 18 graduate credit hours in 2 social science disciplines, and intending that you could teach at the community college level or at a university. If you have 18 credits, you can make the claim and teach in the field. So I did actually history and geography in this social science education program. Always loved history and had some great professors there, but it actually was geography that kind of blew my mind. And it was Dr. Kathleen Schroeder, who's still there. And she opened up her first class. I think it was a class in regional analysis, but she opened up the class by writing on the board, "My name is Kathleen Schroeder." And then she made a small m. She said, "I am a small m Marxist geographer." And my mind was blown. What does that even mean, right? And then she's a small m Marxist feminist geographer, right? And so that was a huge moment for me of thinking about geography in entirely different ways.
Mm.
And that really was pretty huge, right? Then, and I was encouraged at that time. I had a great history professor, actually, who passed away quite some time ago, but he was a great professor, and he actually encouraged me to do a PhD. Now, he was a medievalist, right? So he wanted me to be a medievalist. So he had this plan that he was going to get me into Kansas. And we're going to do medieval history, and we're going to. But I was poor and had student loans and had an opportunity to apply for Broughton High School in Raleigh, North Carolina, and did, and took the job. I just couldn't think about affording graduate school at that point. But what's important about it is Dr. Keefe had put in the back of my head, you should do a PhD. You can do that level of work. I've seen it. And he was like one of my favorite professors of all time. This guy was a great educator. And he said, you can do it. So that was always in the back of my head. So then when it came time to start thinking about that, that was one of the voices that I heard. And so then I went to UNC-Chapel Hill, back to Carolina, to do the PhD in a program called Culture, Curriculum, and Change. It's kind of an innovative program. And of course, the dean at the time was one Madeline Grumet. And the story is I was doing okay in that first year of programming, but it was rolling into a class on curriculum theory with Madeline Grumet. that kind of like that geography class just blew my mind in the sense of I didn't know we could do work like that. And I almost immediately it was, I want to do work like that. She was just amazing. And what I've often said is it was that class that gave me some language for what I felt in my gut by being a teacher.
Mm.
And you know, I had great, it's Carolina, I had great professors there, but really wasn't kind of clicking for me until I rolled into curriculum theory with Madeline Gourmet, which was terrifying also. We kind of coined a term, crazy smart, right? With one word, which is she's so smart, it's crazy.
Well, you know, Primo, I don't know if you know this, in old days, we used to have what was called the scary list, the scary people list. So that was Madeline Gourmet, Patty Lather, Deborah Britzman, you know, the people that were major figures and really scary.
Yeah, exactly. Try being a first year grad student in her class.
Right, exactly.
But you know, that feeling that this is language for me that again is useful. Again, because I was a happy high school teacher, and I was, there were times when I was pretty close to saying, you know what, forget this PhD thing. I want to go teach kids. And like everybody, I think I had some of those doubts and thoughts. But I often told the story too, because it's genealogy, right? I remember a pro seminar we had, and it's the first night of class of my first semester, and we're doing introductions, right? And so the person next to me, right, who does the introduction, Chris Osmond, as a matter of fact, brilliant scholar. He's at Appalachian State now as faculty, but he had just come from Stanford, where he did a master's thesis with Elliot Eisner.
Mm.
On my other side was John Kitchens, who just came from LSU, where he did a master's thesis under Bill Piner. For me, 2 weeks ago, I was teaching 10th graders World Civ. So almost immediately, that imposter syndrome, I'm in the wrong room, right? Because these folks had language that I just didn't have, right? I just didn't have it. Right? Now, I will say it was also Madeline who said to me once, I thought that being that close to high school was a disadvantage. I thought it limited what I could do. And actually it was Madeline Gourmet who told me, no, that's your strength, right? Because when you write about teachers, you honor them. And that was also a groundbreaking moment because I shifted. I didn't think of being that proximity as being a negative. And I tried to keep as much of that as I could in how I was doing the work that I was doing.
So did you stayed at Chapel Hill?
I did.
Okay, because it sounded like maybe you were going to look for just a straight curriculum theory program.
Well, I was still learning what that even was.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's what an interesting thing there too is also at Carolina was George Noblet. Mm-hmm. And Noblet is just retired, but really famous, should be, right, for the mentoring work that he did at UNC-Chapel Hill, particularly students of color. It's just unbelievable, right, the work that he did. He ended up chairing my dissertation. But George is one of the ones who said, okay, Rob, I don't think you're going to get everything you want here in the School of Ed. Of course, I'm like, well, what do you mean? Right? What does that even mean? He says, I want you to go over to cultural studies.
Right.
And I want you to, they've got a certificate program over there. And I want you to go over there. And I think that's where you're going to get the theory that you want.
Mm-hmm.
And
so Grossberg was there, right?
Yeah, right. So, so, and also Della Pollock, John McCowan, a guy named John Pickles in geography wrote a really important book for me called History of Spaces. But yeah, so Larry Grossberg ended up being on my committee.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And so that was all George saying, you need to go over there and get theory. And that was, there weren't a lot of education folks doing that at that time. But it was unbelievable.
Well, my memory of George is just at AESA, walking around with a cadre of current students, former students, you know, I mean, it was a scene. It was a big crew around him. So that speaks to the mentoring that you're talking about, and the way that he was able to relate to people and bring them into the field and bring them into feeling like scholars and being scholars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I probably shouldn't say this, but we refer to that as the Carolina Mafia. But it truly is.
Presence.
It's a national network.
Yeah.
There are people that I can call, right? Because George facilitated that, right? And it was students, former students, students of students, those kinds of things. And then there were like the kind of honorary members. And I remember one of the very first folks that I met, and it was at a party at ARA, the unofficial Carolina party that George usually hosted. And I remember walking by, being a little nervous because I noticed that George is talking to Patty Lather. And at that time, I knew who Patty Lather was.
Scary.
Yeah, yes. And George literally, I'm walking by like, wow, that's cool. Patty Lather is here, right? And he didn't stop talking, and his arm shot out, grabbed me, pulled me over. When there was a break in the conversation, he said, Patty, do you know Rob Helfenbein? Rob, this is Patty Lather. And that introduction started a friendship, but also really a mentorship with Patty that I still maintain. And it was hugely important to me to be able to talk with someone like Patty Lather. And that was George who made sure that introduction happened.
Nice.
Yeah.
Why, you know, our program is hybrid. So, you know, I'm thinking we have a lot of Georgia Southern graduates. We don't really have that kind of same network. And I think a lot of that has to do with being online. You know, if you're in a full-time program where you're in the building, in the presence, you can build a community of scholars more organically. Of course, it takes stewardship, it takes mentorship, it takes a desire from the professors to build that, or at least to direct it some way, channel it. But online, it's very, very difficult to have.
Yeah. But I think your summer collaborative, I think, is an intentional move to work on that a little bit.
For sure.
Yeah. And that's, Ming Fong brought me down that one, I forget what year that was. That's connecting people to national scholars.
Right.
And
now you're just a drive away. Well, it'll be online this year, but.
Yeah. But I always thought that was a brilliant way to think about, kind of a creative way to handle some of the constraints of the program.
For sure. Yeah.
So Rob, you said you had connections with Georgia. What connections are those?
Well, it's just the list of folks. I thought about Georgia Southern, certainly, but Kennesaw, right? You've got Eugenia Whitlock, right. Eric Malusky, Natalia Jaramillo, Jim Garrett is at UGA, Betty St. Pierre's at UGA. When I started listing like people that I know and like their work and use their work, that list is pretty good, right? There's a pretty good showing, I think, of curriculum, or at least curriculum attendant kind of folks.
So you want to talk a little bit about, you talked about getting introduced to geography and space and place. What were, some of the ideas that sparked you there?
Well, it was the dissertation. I did a little bit of, not much, but a little bit of reading. I mentioned that John Pickles book in the doctorate, but it really wasn't until the dissertation. And I did a dissertation about an after-school computer lab that was actually across the street from the high school that I used to teach at. And one of the things I noticed quite early is the way the students talked about it. And it was very much a, well, over here, you can da 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 da. But over there, da 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 da, right? They, in the way they talked about the lab and the school, it was very much a here, there distinction. Actually, it's a spatial distinction. And certain things were possible within the lab that they didn't see as possible at the high school. So almost automatically, I felt like there's a spatial thing happening, right? That's interesting, right? And then I wrote about it as a curriculum of no curriculum, also, in that one of the things that enabled those students to use the space was that it was completely voluntary. You didn't have, the only rule was if the computers were full and somebody needed to do homework and you were doing something else, you had to give them your computer. So there was a priority to schoolwork. But other than that, and then what I realized was these were kids that were basically marginalized at the school across the street. And it was this amazing mashup, right, of kids that kind of didn't fit the social order across the street. And it was poor kids, it was kids of color, it was gay kids, punk rock kids, goth kids, and they were all kind of in this space, kind of making it their own, which to me was almost immediately fascinating, right? Like, what is going on here? Like it did feel really different from the school where, the old, how the cafeteria is segregated by social groups, it felt like this mashup of something else is operating here.
The margins came to the center.
Yeah, and it was, and of course, once I got to interviewing the kids, that it was really clear that this was a strategic usage of this space. This was about resistance and resilience, right? Because they talked about kids making other choices. And again, they did it spatially. Now, I asked some spatial questions, but so they talked about the kids on the corner smoking and getting ready to get in trouble, right? Right? Or these other.
Always nothing good ever happens at the corner, right?
That's right. That's right. But they were very aware of all that, right? But here was a space where they could work together to be successful at a high school that they were very clear was set up for them to fail. And so to me, that I got really interested in that. And so one of the themes, and it's a theme that's persisted throughout my work. And I've been, thinking about it a lot recently because I have a book that's getting ready to come out. But I used the theme of spaces of possibility, right? So my dissertation had the three big themes were spaces that speak, meaning what do spaces tell us? What do we learn from spaces? I'm now calling that the spatio-curricular, right? So what do spaces teach us? And then spaces leak, which means there's always that kind of line of flight, right? So it's kind of an agency structural way to think about it is you can try to constrain things as much as possible, but they always leak, right? So almost a, Desserteau's notion of walking in the city, maybe is familiar where you're at the top of the skyscraper and you look down and all you see is the grid, right? And so you see red lights and green lights, traffic moving, and you see the grid and you see structure. But when you get down to the sidewalk, right, people pause, right? People linger, people take the long way home. People are romantic about spaces, right? Nostalgic or whatever it might be. And so there's more agency there than you might think, and it has to do with changing the scale of analysis. And then the last was spaces of possibility, which I thought this computer lab was that kind of space of possibility. And my politics then say, well, if I can find these spaces of possibility, and I've been able to find them all throughout the country, where kids are using them in terms of resistance and resilience, then the political project seems to be to create more of those spaces. That's the politics.
Yeah. And are you finding them in Macon?
It's a little, COVID time is a little
Right.
difficult. I mean, I'm starting a research project now that's actually a program evaluation here in Atlanta that is for organizations that work with refugee and immigrant kids in the Atlanta community.
Nice.
Just starting it, got a lot to learn, but I'm excited because again, new city, I'm starting from scratch. I don't have the community connections that I might have somewhere else, but I'm interested to do that. I mean, I think part of what you can hear too is I've always been interested in the hopefully productive connections between qualitative research and curriculum theory. And I don't think we have to do that. I don't think curriculum theory has to be that, but I'm interested in those possibilities. And Gabriel Huddleston and I, we did a special issue of Taboo that we called Toward the Concrete. And that's part of what we argued for, which was, an attention to qualitative research and what it enables for us in curriculum theorizing.
So by qualitative research, you mean kind of like ethnography, or what do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, that's, George Noblet. So I come from a pretty honest ethnography background. At the time, he was working on a concept of post-critical ethnography, which basically requires a deeper positionality than even critical ethnography. Yeah, but I like, one of those powerful tools, I think, of curriculum studies that I mentioned in the beginning is thinking about the enacted curriculum, and I think so. David Flinders did some writing on that. It's a couple different places, but that the moments in teaching when curriculum is actually enacted, right? I think there's a lot to learn there. And I think I don't think we should give up that area of analysis to teacher ed. I mean, the teacher ed can do their thing, but I think there's a particular type of curriculum analysis we can do in paying attention to the enactment that is powerful.
Do you know the work of Susan Talbert at all?
I don't think I do.
She was at, the last I heard, Georgia State, and she might have gone into women's studies, but she was doing curriculum and qualitative studies 20 years ago, and talking. I remember we actually brought her down as a guest speaker when I first came to Georgia Southern. We had kind of like a speaker series, and I remember the students asking her, well, what about validity and reliability? And Susan's like, what? What does that even mean? Right. I don't even know what you're talking about. And they thought it was so funny, because they hear this all the time, in their, well, I did too when I was I had to take statistics. You hear it in classes like that. But I remember Susan going, I don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
But, but you might look to hook up with her because if she's probably still at Georgia State. I lost touch with her years ago because I think she got out of the field and went into women's studies. And we see this, like you were talking about someone else, and I know in Bill Piner's generation, there were a bunch of people who did this, like Dwayne Hubner. He bailed on the field and went to Yale, became the dean of the divinity school because he got so disgusted with this, with the whole kind of college of education mentality and the anti-intellectualism. And my goodness, we are still fighting the same fights that Dwayne Hubner fought. And how many people bail the field because of this frustration, right? Mm-hmm. And I certainly get that. And I'm not going to bail the field, but sometimes I feel like, can I go somewhere else? I mean, I was actually writing a thing for the university today talking about starting a center for the humanities, where we could have a place where we could have cross collaboration, across colleges where we could, all of us could work on keeping the humanities alive against this kind of tide of, I don't know what you think about this, but I have a real problem with STEM education. And I worry that humanities are falling apart, and that they're disappearing, and that would be the death of the liberal arts curriculum. And so anyway, that's talking about fleeing the field, right? So You know, that's
Well,
a-
I think that's a reality. And my first thought there is like, well, okay, what are we doing, right? What is the stewardship, right?
right.
Are we, I'm at it's weird, but I'm at a point in my career, right, where I'm becoming the senior scholar, right? If we don't do it, right,
Mhm.
who's going to do it, right?
Right.
So, that how are we, when we're thinking about program development, when we're thinking about course of study, where are the curriculum courses, and are we fighting for them, right?
I think
Um,
all of our phones have gone off at some point. We should have
Right.
talked about silencing them before we
Welcome to
started recording.
the Zoom world and phone and cell
Right, right.
Yeah, it's so nice because it's from Scam Likely.
That guy calls me all the time.
Rob, I feel the same way that you do. It's like, oh my God, I'm getting gray hair. I mean,
Right, right.
are we now the senior scholars? And yes, we are. And it just seems like 2 seconds ago that I was on a panel with you at AERA and we were like fresh out of graduate school.
Yeah,
And
right.
it's boom, and here we are. Like now it's us and a lot of people
Right.
are retiring or whatever. And it's like,
You've made the scary list for other ones.
I hope not. But it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
kind of
And then there's a lot of curriculum folks that are in leadership roles now. I mean, you mentioned that you've also had one of these conversations with Denise Taliaferro-Bazil,
yeah,
Mhm.
who I think is an acting dean right now.
she is.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah,
and so people are in provost's office, people are deans and department chairs, and sometimes I
Multicultural
kind of want to
center.
say, how are we fighting for the field
yeah.
when we get to these positions?
Right. Yeah, and you're in a deanship position, right?
Yeah, associate dean for research.
That's cool. So I mean, what kind of power do you have as far as change? Oh, well, maybe I shouldn't ask you that. But I mean, do you have any real power as a person who can change curriculum?
Well, I mean, it's not technically in my portfolio, right? As they say, there's another dean for academic affairs. But certainly there's a leadership team and there's a leadership conversation. I mean, I tend to think pretty holistically about
Mhm.
higher ed programs, and initiative. I think, for example, I think if the job is to kind of nurture and foster a research culture, then you've got to attend to the PhD program. Seems to me, right? So the idea that those are separate, frankly, is crazy. Now, in my view, because not everybody agrees with me, and so that's a tension. That's a point of struggle. But
I guess
I see them as connected. Sure.
Another question, that's related to that is how has curriculum studies informed the way you think of being a dean, of being an
Right.
administrator?
Well, I love that question, actually. And I've thought about it a lot. And actually, I was thinking about Marla, the idea about the humanities is, I think the type of training that we get as curriculum studies scholars is maybe somewhat unique in the possibilities of breadth, right, of the work that we can attend to. So like, when I was at Indiana University, I hung out with the philosophers. Now, for the longest time, they could never figure out who the long-haired guy was, right? Who's the guy talking about Foucault, right? And so, but was the conversation that I was in. Then when I was at Loyola University, Maryland in Baltimore, it was actually the theologians that I was hanging out with, right? And in part because my thing has always been, well, where's the smart stuff, right? I want to find out where the smart stuff is and be in that conversation. But the other thing that's interesting to your question, Dan, is if you've got any kind of critical approach, which I would argue is pretty much certainly what curriculum theory is, or in part, certainly a big part of what it is, that can be really useful, right? Because you're the study of power, right? And power that's both formal and then informal, right? The ways in which power can be obscured or it can marginalize or do certain things. If that's what you're trained to study, higher ed is a pretty fascinating place.
These days.
Yeah, so for example, when I was at Loyola, we had a big on committees and committee work there, and in the budget, I think it was I forget what it was, but one of the university governance committees, and they had student government representatives. So these are undergrads, right, that they would have in the meeting, and they can vote actually, which I thought was cool, right, and progressive. Problem is nobody preps them, right? So I would usually sit next to the undergrads, and I'd talk to the undergrads, and then we kind of would debrief and stuff. And so I would say things like, okay, well, after the meeting, like, okay, well, where's the power in the room? Like, oh, well, so and so is the chair. I mean, she led the meeting. Like, yeah, that's officially. But where's the real power? Well, what do you mean? Well, who did most of the talking? Right? Who drove the agenda once it actually got formally introduced? Who's driving this train? Like, well, that would be so and so. Yeah, not the chair. Right? And what's that role? And how do you think that role worked? How do you think you got there? So actually, I mean, now it can be a bit of a burden, right? Because you're by necessity kind of thrust into faculty politics, and you see the politics in everything.
Mhm.
Sometimes it feels like it might be nice to not be aware of that stuff, but I just kind of can't do it.
Hard to turn off the brain once you've given that lens to look through.
Yeah, exactly. And then you start to be like talking points. That's my latest thing now. So you can really, if you're paying attention, you can really see the talking points, right?
Mhm.
That these are the four things somebody told them they needed to say, because everybody's saying it,
Mhm.
right?
So you said two things I'm gonna comment on, because Shirley Steinberg used the exact same terms. One of them, the phrase she used was the curriculum of no curriculum.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
used, and then she also made a big point of talking about power, and
Mhm.
how really, if you don't understand power, you can't understand anything else, especially where we are in education, whether it's whatever level, K through 12, university, whatever. And then you talked about curriculum as being a critical discipline. So I think there's some overlap there,
Sure.
intergenerational overlap. I don't know how well you know Shirley, but you said things that she said, and I think that's kind of that's the kind of interesting patterns that we find when we do this
Yeah.
genealogical work.
Yeah, I know Shirley not super well, but she's got a cultural studies background too. That's certainly what cultural studies kind of via Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies, which is kind of my lineage. I take great pride in saying that I'm Stuart Hall's academic grandson, because Larry Grossberg was the first American student of Stuart Hall.
Mhm.
That's no joke, right? So I'm very pleased, right, to be connected with that, and then to study Stuart Hall with Larry Grossberg was quite something, and a huge influence on me too. But again, that cultural studies defined in that way is an inherently political project, right? But yeah, it is particularly useful. I mean, so I've had folks that have asked me about COVID policies, for example, and how universities are responding to COVID. And I surprised a few people too. But when those things were being worked out, I said, find out the percentage of your budget that is housing. If you're at a university that has a significant housing budget, they're going to go face to face. And the reason is what you've got is a fiscal imperative,
Mhm.
right? It's these smaller institutions. Well, some of them are big too. But if that's where the revenue is coming from, or a significant chunk of the revenue, then they have to defend it.
There was some information that came out pretty early on that USG, farms out the running of the dormitories, and that company pretty much said, you are still going to owe everything you owe to us, right? And then of course they're saying face to face, we need people in the dorms, no problem.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm not sure if that's the same dynamic you're talking about, but I mean,
Pretty
once
close.
again,
Pretty close.
yeah, a lot of overlap.
But it's you can call it a hidden curriculum here, right? Like, what are we learning, right? Well, we're learning about how decision making actually happens, right? As opposed to what's formally said,
Mhm.
right? So, and don't misunderstand me. This has gotten me in plenty of trouble. Um, you know, because I just kind of feel like that type of analysis and critique, and then some truth telling, is a better way to proceed. To me, that's the ethics of it, right? And as we, continue down this road of kind of a corporatist business model of higher ed, again, Marley, you were kind of noting that a bit recently. It's the ethics that gets lost because your motivations are different.
Yeah.
Right? It's a profit motive versus something else.
And there's always the dream world of what the university or what the college experience is, and that's what's always sold and talked about and dreamed about, but rarely does anyone actually come to defend that. I find in my institution, and talking with other people in other institutions as well, the life of the mind, the challenge of coming into contact with other ideas and other people, and being challenged to think harder than you have before. People don't defend that very much in the university.
Right. Which is horrible.
Not to say you
Terrible.
can't find it. I mean, I'm not saying that if you seek it, you can find it, because there are enough professors there who are interested in mentoring students along those paths.
But there's a lot at stake in that. There's a lot at stake. I actually was just talking to my undergrad college roommate, who's a brilliant biochemist. And it's so interesting, but one of the things that he said is the most important course he ever took was the history of science. And the reason is, and he's a scientist, right? But the reason is it exposed him to science as a socially constructed discipline, and as something that's not fixed. It's very fluid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Particularly over time, and it changed the way he thought about what it means to be a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's remarkable, right? And I feel like if we could, we've got to tell those stories, I think, because they are important pieces of what a curriculum, in this case higher ed, could be.
Well, that was Kuhn's analysis, right? Structures of scientific revolutions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But here's someone who it hadn't thought about it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Was already in on a track to be a scientist, clearly had skills, clearly knew things, right? And then it was a course like that kind of flipped the switch for him, right? To think differently about what it means to be a scientist.
Yeah. It's its own fantasy, objective truth. Politics don't have any place in the way we analyze physical properties.
And now we're in John Weaver territory.
I was thinking, I know this is a Zoom interview, and just but on the top of my head, I was thinking of how could we build a consortium between our curriculum program and your institution, because there are a lot of students there who are now where our students are faculty, right?
Oh, it's a good handful for sure.
And so it would be an interesting experiment to build bridges between these institutions. I mean, I know Mercer's a very different kind of place, but we've got a lot of common ground. Wouldn't that be kind of an interesting project? I'm very open to that. I'm very interested in that as well. And I've again kind of thought about it before, right? Is there a way to think about curriculum studies as more of a network instead of nodes, right? You've got right.
I mean, certainly Georgia Southern is kind of over my career has been ascendant, right? In terms of that particular curriculum program and the summer collaborative and those things, and now this project and the journal, right? So there's moves being made, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's folks down at LSU that are trying to kind of come back to kind of its traditional prominent role in the field.
Molly's there.
What's that?
Molly Quinn.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that would be I think it's the smarter way to move, right? And so when I was at Indiana, I don't want to be too controversial, but Indiana kind of moved to more towards a discipline-based, more of a curriculum and instruction type program than curriculum studies. And you could see it in when people left or retired, who they got replaced with.
Yeah.
Right. He said cryptically. But I did have students that occasionally were clearly into curriculum theory, right? Started attending Bergamo, looking to publish in JCT, attending curriculum and pedagogy. They were clearly kind of in the curriculum theory side. And so I started sending them to LSU they do a curriculum camp, right? And so go down to LSU, work with these folks, and they came back, this was a transformational experience. But I think we have to be intentional about that, Marla. I think we should be thinking about what are the connections that we can create.
I mean, we've got Kennesaw, we've got we've got Mercer, we've got some folks at UGA, Georgia State, we've got LSU, we've got this whole Southern kind of thing going on here. And yeah, and you're the space place guy, right?
Yeah.
So a consortium to me is like this bond, this network that maybe we really seriously ought to consider, because we are so what is it? We are still fighting the same fights that Dwayne Huebner fought in the 1950s, just within our little colleges and stuff, and it's pretty isolating, actually. I mean, our work falls on deaf ears, and you try to do things from the inside and nothing happens, and you look around and you go, oh my God, this is the same fight, and we're not winning.
Well, I mean, I think Georgia, you guys are an exception. LSU is kind of an exception, but I think for most curriculum theorists, they are the lone curriculum person at their institution.
Right.
Right. It is isolated.
An army of us. Yeah.
And that is why spaces like Bergamo matter. And I feel like we should be fighting for it. Right. Is that there need to be spaces, right, for a particular kind of work. And certainly I think in the Bergamo tradition, an experimental, incomplete, excuse me, working, thinking together type of ethos is particularly important. And I know that sometimes people say, well, do we need all these different things? Do we need CNP, Bergamo, AAACS? And my answer is, yeah, I think we do. And I think we do primarily for most of those folks who are the only curriculum person, right? And for one weekend of the year, they get to run those ideas out with people that get it, and can push on those ideas, right, in hopefully constructive ways. So that's the other piece. We have to defend those spaces. Yeah. Division B is interesting. Again, I don't know how much we want to get into it, but Division B is an evolving thing too. And it was Schubert that reminded me too, because I was the chair of the SIG at one point, the Critical Issues in Curriculum and Cultural Studies SIG, which of course that was created when Division B was dominated by the ASCD folks, right? So you couldn't get any curriculum theorizing into Division B. So they created SIG as a space really for the reconceptualization, right? But then as Division B shifted, right, and leadership shifted, right, and I was involved in some of that, others were involved in some of that, suddenly it kind of raises a question, well, if you can get into Division B, then why do we need the SIG? But then Division B moves in another direction, right? I think the Bill Ayers years is kind of a marker of a shift in Division B, where maybe the SIG is important again, right? In a sense for a more theoretical, less kind of activist focused type of curriculum work.
See, I don't, I mean, I hate to admit this, but I don't really know too much about Division B. I haven't really been involved too much because I really don't care for AERA.
Yeah.
It's just too big and too alienating, and I've never really enjoyed the conference, but I remember one time Bill Dahl saying that there was a time when there were no curriculum theorists in Division B.
Yeah. Schubert says the same thing.
Right. And that's, for me, it's like, like talking about Foucault and history and how things weren't always the way they were. You think they were always this way, and we take it for granted that we've got some of our folks who are in leadership positions, but it wasn't always like that.
That's right.
And
Right.
it might not always stay the same if we don't fight for that space, right?
That's right.
So I'm just saying to myself, maybe I ought to get more involved, right?
Well, but one reason why it is important, though, and I get that too. ARA is a unwieldy beast, to be sure. But I always think about the junior faculty, and the thing is, for most folks, particularly if they're in R1s or R2s, they better be at ARA pre-tenure, right? Because the thing about it is it's recognized everywhere, and we were certainly trained that way at Carolina. Is the 4 letters that better be on your vita are AERA. Now that's not universally shared, but it is universally recognized, right? So those folks have got to be at ARA, and so it's important that we do nurture some of those spaces for them to do that work. Without the Carolina party, though, it's kind of lost some of its appeal for me. But.
So where do you see Division B going now? Like you're saying there's been another shift sort of away from curriculum studies leadership.
Well, no, it's still curriculum studies, but I think it's there is a bit of an activist, public advocacy, policy focus, where
I've always had an issue with this. I mean, there's been discussions about this, like, does curriculum studies want to put out a policy statement about education? This always troubles me. But anyways, I didn't mean to.
Well, I would say that is a very real tension in the field right now.
I know.
There's a lot of people that would say, yes, we do, and that's what we should be doing.
Right.
So I don't know. It's kind of, now, again, COVID years, I think all bets are off to make any kind of statement about what's happening. But yeah, it's interesting. Leadership matters, right? So leaderships, they staff the program committees, and then that there tend to be emphases and decisions that matter in terms of the kind of work that gets on the program. I mean, I remember at one point. And I was reviewing, I've always stayed pretty connected to Division B. I was program chair 1 year. But I think it was the Bill Ayers years, and I love Bill. I'm not trying to pick a fight. But I remember telling someone, like, well, if somebody wanted to do just a straight up 10th grade World Civ curriculum project, where in the categories of Division B would they submit? Because when you looked for a few years there, you looked at it, there wasn't anywhere to do it, right? And my fear was that they'd go to teacher ed. Is that if they can't see themselves, they can't see their work within how it gets framed. That's what people do, right? Particularly more emergent scholars. If they look at those descriptions, they look at those categories, and if they don't see their work reflected in there, they're going to find somewhere else, right? And that's a concern for me. Now, I'm not dying to read another curriculum study about 10th grade World Civ. I'm not dying to do that, but I think there needs to be a space for that work. And I don't think everything is teacher ed. I like, as I began, I think we've got some particular tools, and I think we ask a particular kind of question that's valuable.
Right. I mean, we read teaching and learning like a text, and that certainly is a place where teaching and learning happens, and we need to have spaces for that kind of analysis for people who are interested under the tent of curriculum studies.
Yeah,
seems pretty basic.
But if there's a theme here, right, we have to fight for those spaces. And I think whether it's spaces within programs of study at our institutions, or if it's conference spaces, or it's the unwieldiness of ARA, I think those are good fights to have. And I think it's kind of incumbent upon us to do that work.
Well, and with the this new journal that I founded, Dan's co-editing with me, which we're slowly getting off the ground, very slowly, because when you get started, things move kind of slowly, trying to figure out. It's been a long time since I've done a journal, and it's just, as it's an overwhelming amount of work. But at any rate, that's another important thing. I think the reason I wanted to found another journal is there just aren't enough venues for curriculum studies scholars to publish in. I mean, we only have about, I don't know, 5 or 6, maybe 7 journals at most. And then you got to go outside the field to get published. And that's just not enough. And there's just not enough venues for us.
Yeah.
And the publishing is talk about archiving a field. That's how you archive a field, right? And if we don't have the venues, and the venues are, slowly fading away, we're a fading away problem.
Yeah.
So that's why I think it's important. Another important part of genealogy is to do these journal projects and to keep them going, which is very difficult.
Yeah. And largely thankless.
Yeah, I know that. No.
But Marla, do you remember you were in the audience at my first Bergamo presentation?
Remind me.
It was, so this is a genealogy project, right?
Okay.
I was still a student, and I was on a panel with Jesse Goodman,
Okay.
Oh, right.
who stormed in about 25 minutes late. I was in the middle of my paper.
I do not recall that, but okay.
And it was an audience. I think it was you, it was Mary, and I think there was a third person. And I'm a graduate student, and in versus Jesse Goodman, who doesn't do Jesse Goodman. He doesn't sit in the back and politely say, please, and then elegantly comes to the table apologizing for being late. That is not what he did. He stormed in, flurry of paper and all kinds of stuff, and sits down next to me, and I'm in the middle of my paper. And so that was my very first Bergamo paper presentation. I think about it every time I go in that room.
That's so cool.
And it was quite some time, probably almost 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
You ended up working with him, huh?
What's
At
that?
Indiana. You ended up working with him at Indiana.
Yeah, I did. And I embarrassed him greatly with that story one year at ARA. He's like, oh, I don't even remember that, man. I was like, no, you probably don't, right? But I do. And he didn't have a paper. He did this, like, if I may, I'm sorry, but incoherent rambling. I don't know what it was. It was clearly just here's some stuff I've been thinking about, right? And I was like, can you do that? I don't even know. But the important part of the story, you can if you're Jesse Goodman, I guess, right?
Yeah.
But you and Mary came up to me after and said, we want to publish that paper in the journal.
And which paper was that? Maybe I can remember the paper. Was it on the racetrack? The racetrack thing at NASCAR?
No, it wasn't the racetrack one. That's a little later. It was about, I was looking at social studies textbooks. The framing was towards a geography of getting lost.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I remember. Yes. Yes, I do remember.
And that was my first JCT publication.
There you go. Long time ago.
So, and I would always tell that story, one, because it's funny to talk about Jesse Goodman, but the other is there may not be a lot of people in your presentation, but they might be the right people, right? And so for me, that was certainly true. I was getting a publication in a curriculum theory journal, and I was still a doctoral student, so I was pretty thrilled.
You never know who's in the audience.
That's right. Well, Dan, you kind of asked what is it? What's helped you from curriculum studies and doing administrative work?
Yeah.
And I had another thought. Is that one of the ones that I find very helpful, again, gets me in plenty of trouble though, is the question of, well, is this policy or is this process?
Mhm.
Now, people hate that question, right? Because you're digging it. Part of what I'm trying to say is one of the ways that bureaucracy works is it claims policy all the time, right? But in a lot of cases, it's not actually policy. It's just process,
Mhm.
right? This is the way we do things, right? And at one point, I asked that question at this previous institution, and person got very like, "Why do you keep asking that question?" I said, "I'm asking the question because the fix is different, right? If I've got a problem I'm trying to solve, and policy's in the way, well, there's a way to change policy, right? And so I need to know if that's the way I need to move. But if it's process, there's another set of solutions, right? So again, it's kind of like formal and informal curriculum, right?
Mhm.
And what finally got somebody's attention, I said, can you cut and paste it and put it in an email? Because if you can, it's policy.
Right.
If you can't, it's process,
Right.
right? And kind of and the ways in which people claim policy, well, that's policy. Okay, send it to me, right? And then I'll look at the policy and we'll adjust. But that's a strategy of working within an often nonsensical bureaucracy,
Mhm.
which in my mind would just be a whole lot easier if we were just open about it, right? Just openly talked about it, right? Okay.
Well, I had a few years of doing a program review, right? And we were supposed to have this, keys, what do they call them? Not keyframes, but not keystone,
Assessments, key assessment.
key assessments. Thank you. Key something. Um, so we had these key assessments that we were supposed to talk with the faculty with and create a strategy for the next year, right? Well, they hand me the key assessments 2 hours before the report is due, the data from these key assessments. So there's no way I'm going to gather with the faculty. We're going to come up with a plan and then I'm going to put that in the report. So I just put in the report what we're actually going to do to change the program, which we had already discussed and which we had already evaluated based on our own experience in the program. Well, they sent it back. You have to rewrite this because your changes have to be based on the data. And I said, I'm not going to do it. And that was that. I got a bad mark for writing a report not based on data that was, they got me 2 hours beforehand. So this is just the kind of insanity that ensues in the bureaucracy at higher ed. But I mean, I think that's a good question in terms of policy and process, and there's almost a lock-in that occurs. Like we start doing something, maybe at one point it's a policy and we begin to do it, and then the policy changes, but we still do that old bureaucratic process and it just piles on and piles on till, we need to clear away some of this stuff and get out of the lock-in.
Well, and for me, and I really believe this is, I think one of the roles of administration should be to clear that stuff out of the way of faculty.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I was working, this is back in Indianapolis, with a school principal, and he said, my job is to be the buffer between the district and these teachers, because I've got these great teachers and I want them to do what they're great at. I don't want them to do, this is what he said, I don't want them to do the bullshit the district says.
Mm-hmm.
I want them doing the wonderful work that they do with these teachers. And it's always stuck with me. And unfortunately, you can get a bit of a reputation as a troublemaker. But I think that's part of my role as an administrator, right?
Mm-hmm.
is to clear out the way for faculty that are doing the real work of the institution. I don't see, a lot of people do, but I don't see administration as an adversarial relationship with faculty. Unfortunately, it often plays out that way. And I'm not afraid of policy either, right? I think often policy can be what protects faculty.
Mm-hmm.
And so a good administrator, I think, kind of tries to do those things.
Right.
And get stuff out of the way, right? Let professors teach, research, let them do that work and make it easier, not harder. Things are hard enough, man.
So let's find a way to, come to a conclusion here.
Okay.
We could talk about, if you have some thoughts about the future of the field or something along that line.
Well, I think we've been kind of tracing that throughout this conversation.
Yeah.
Um,
Looking at the past, you tend to look at the future too.
yeah. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. One thing I'll say about Division B is I remember going to a few of those business meetings, and it was 20 people and little cubes of cheese, and that has certainly kind of shifted, right? It's often, you know what I'm talking about, bad white wine and little cubes of cheese. But those lately have been standing room only, packed. So there are young folks, or more emergent, I guess is a better way to say that, graduate students and scholars that are seeing curriculum as a place where they can do work, and I think that's encouraging. My time running JCT and Bergamo was nothing but growth, right? We really increased the attendance, participation in that, and we had to do some intentional things to try to get there, but that was encouraging. When I see some of the things that y'all are doing at Georgia Southern, some of the things Molly and her colleagues down at LSU, I think is exciting. And these other places around the country, I think that there is some reason to be encouraged. But the flip side is we're going to have to defend, right, and see ourselves as stewards of a field of study that I think can get marginalized. Not everything is teacher ed, and I know the blasphemy of blasphemy is not everything is literacy. And so we're going to have to defend those spaces. Now, I mean, I think there's some very exciting stuff happening, whether it's affect theory, the new materialisms and post-humanism stuff is rich, and there's a lot of curriculum folks that are going in on that, and with some critiques too, not that are well founded. But I do think there is a certain stripe of scholarship that's largely coming out of Black feminist writers that is remarkable, and it's firing up students. And so that to me is really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's some theoretical interventions that are happening that make sense to curriculum folks. Mm-hmm. That's the other thing, is right. Kind of the training in curriculum studies, I think enables one to pick up a Catherine McKittrick, right, or Tiffany Lethobo King, who's at Georgia State, right, and to take up that work and see the connections almost immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So that is pretty exciting. So and I've never gone to this conference, but people love the Norman Denzin ICQI conference. You know that one?
Mm-hmm.
International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, I think. Patty's a fixture there, I think. But there's a lot. I talk to a lot of curriculum folks who go there. So technically, it's a methodology conference with some heavy theoretical work that's being done. But a lot of that are curriculum people, right? They're finding these other spaces to do this work, and they're really, I think, kind of leading the field. But I think you're right. To another point, Marla, is we don't want them to jump ship. Right? We want to make sure that there's spaces for them to do that work within the field, right? As well as kind of representing outside.
Right, because the temptation to jump ship is always there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, colleges of education are not, what's the word? I'd rather be in a college of liberal arts. I have more in common with the liberal arts faculty, because I come out of the liberal arts. I come out of philosophy, religious studies, and the questions that people ask in colleges of education are baffling to me. Like, why are you still talking about that? They talked about that in 1902 or something, right? I'm like, oh my goodness, what kind of a college is this,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it's just because of my background,
Yeah.
I don't come out of education. Questions of methodology just piss me off. I'm like, who cares? Like, didn't you read that book, Truth is Method, and there's no truth in method? I mean, let's get over it already and move on and do some important work. But people still ask that. Or I go to conferences and they're like, this isn't practical enough. And I'm like, oh my God, I give up. I'm so tired of it, right?
Yeah, I
Which
know.
is, which is why Dwayne Hubner left. And I'm like, I don't want to be another Dwayne Hubner and flee the field. I could, but I'm not going to do it. But it's very hard to stay home where you feel you're not welcome. And
Yeah.
that's the same battle that this field has been having forever.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, colleges of education are training for a job, just like business school.
Right.
It's training for a job,
Right.
and that limits the questions that a lot of people ask outside of curriculum studies within the College of Ed. And it makes us seem baffling to them.
Yes. Yeah. Why does philosophy matter?
Why does philosophy matter? Why does history matter?
Why is politics? Why are politics important? I mean, why are we even asking these questions, right?
Mhm.
Why are these questions being asked of us? Or why is it that people who do, more quantitative research look at us like we're from Planet Claire? I'm like, come on, guys. What century is this? Look at where we are. COVID, all right?
Mhm.
We need the humanities. How are we human in a pandemic? How can we help one another? These are basic human questions that are important to ask.
Absolutely. Well, and a cautionary tone too is how, what higher ed looks like post COVID is going to be interesting. And there's certainly there's still some pretty rampant neoliberalism,
Oh yeah,
never waste a crisis,
Absolutely.
right,
higher ed leadership stuff.
Right.
And they are, you can track it, right? There are programs that are being closed down. There are
Right.
mergers happening. There are universities that are closing down because the landscape was pretty rough pre-COVID, right? And so it's going to be interesting to see the wake of this. I think is going to be quite significant beyond just people getting vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
right. And that neoliberal bent is very frightening.
And it's rampant.
Yep.
How much of our education is going to be online now? How much of our teaching will be online now that we have the infrastructure to do it in a synchronous way, not just asynchronous? Even though they've been making the arguments to us because USG wanted to have more face-to-face classes about the brilliance of face-to-face classes and how that's so important to the educational process. Now they're going to flip it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Because it's going to save money.
Well, you kind of can't deny that it can be done, right?
Well, it's a thin version. It can be done.
Well, right. I mean, done. I didn't say great or phenomenal, right? But it's kind of proof of concept, right? But again, as I said earlier, though, if revenue is based on housing, right, then they have to make a face-to-face argument. And that's kind of what I was getting at, right? Is the argument that was largely being made is the power of the teaching experience, the face-to-face teaching experience, and as an institution that cares deeply about teaching. That's the public-facing argument. Underneath it is housing is how we pay the bills, right? So either institutions are going to start rethinking that fiscal model to some degree, right? Or you'll still see that argument go forward. That's the brass tacks of it.
Well, that's a downer.
Yeah, well, but then of course it may be the parameters of the fight, right?
Right.
So maybe that the value of pointing out something like that may be, okay, here's the way in which we're going to have to struggle.
Mhm.
But there's other things. The impacts of COVID, certainly there's health impacts, but the Chronicle just did a report where students of color are way disproportionately dropping out of college, right? That they are being impacted on the academic side in a much more disproportionate way. And that's going to have deep impacts, right? When actually pre-COVID, nationally, there was some pretty good progress happening in terms of educational opportunity, right? As it relates to race, and social class a little bit, right? But looks like that's now been kind of dumped on its head. So what is that going to mean, right? So there could be far-reaching impacts for sure.
For many years to come.
Yeah.
All right. Do you have any more questions, Marla?
No, I think that's it. But thank you for reminding me of that. The session at Bergamo, which I didn't remember.
Yeah.
But
I will never forget it.
that you remembered, and I just don't remember. But I do remember your article. That I do remember.
Yeah. But that's just maybe this is a more positive note to end on. But people ask me, why do you care about Bergen? And that's one piece of the story. It's like, look, I remember being a doctoral student and giving a paper here that turned into a publication, right? But it's also where, it's where I met Greg Demetriadis, right? Who started paying attention to me, and I didn't understand why, right? And in a very generous way, kind of kept up with my work and encouraged me. And I felt like this brilliant scholar was paying attention, right? And that maybe I do have something to say. And it's where some of those other, connections were made, Bill Schubert, talking about the history of the field, going to get a pitcher of beer with Bill Dahl. I remember that, right? Because he thought that at Bergamo, he thought it was too stuffy. So there was a bunch of graduate students huddled around him, and somebody had a van. So he goes, let's go get a beer.
Oh
And
man,
so
drinking was part of it.
So we went to Dayton. Yeah, we went into Dayton, and a group of graduate students sat around, and Bill Dahl just held court for 2 hours over pitchers of beer.
Amazing.
That's priceless.
It is priceless. But the bar was the big thing, right?
Right.
The bartender, the bar, the people we don't remember, Margaret and Dorothy and the bar and the people who really were behind the scenes running everything. That's where the conversations really were had, I think.
Yeah.
After the sessions, in the hallway, at the restaurant,
right. That's right.
I miss all that.
Me too. I can feel it. I can feel it as an absence, right? That is troubling. And I always try to stress those type of ideas with graduate students, is that, yeah, it's a line on your vita, right? Yeah, it's a chance to present your work, but it's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that I always loved about Bergamo, and this stayed true, is, usually if the weather was nice, people would be in the courtyard, right?
Yeah.
They'd get a beer, or a glass of wine or something, and step out into the courtyard. But what would invariably happen at some point, somebody would look at me and say, hey, Rob, what you reading? I'd say, oh, well, I just picked up this new book by da-da-da-da, and I'm reading it. Someone said, really? I'm reading that too, right? Or I thought about that. What do you think? And even though it's an informal thing and we're having a couple drinks, right, there's an intellectual engagement and generativity to it, right? That at least for me, at least 2 special issues came out of that. Right? We did a special issue on Spivak and education. And to my knowledge, it's the only one, the first and only dedicated for Gayatri Spivak and education. And it came out of a courtyard conversation at Bergen, because she had that new globalization and an era of aesthetic education book came out. I said I was reading it. A couple other people said they're either reading it or they want to. And then it turned into, well, let's do it and let's do something next year at Bergamo. We did a panel, really well received, right? And then that turned into a special issue. That's how,
Right.
that's way more than, that's a productive place. That's a generative place.
Right.
And they're
It's
precious,
just informal moments. It's
precious.
it's usually over a beer.
It's the informal curriculum.
Hmm.
I think Bill Schubert calls it that. I don't want
Yeah.
to steal that from him, but
Well, I used to, and I was in Indiana, it was easy to get students to come to Bergamo because it was a drive, right? It was close.
right.
And I would say, well, here's what you need to know. I say, it's not ARA. It's a far, far away from ARA. And I'd say, well, you might get a hard question at Bergamo, but you won't get a mean question, right? And that's the difference, right? It's a heady place, right? This is a place that's built on some serious engagement with ideas, right? So yeah, you might get a hard question, right? But it won't be a mean grandstanding question that you sometimes see at ARA,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
If somebody's asking you about,
Mhm.
whatever, and its connection to what you've presented, they're actually asking you.
Right.
They want to know what
And
that is.
you're right about that. And that's one of the things about those big conferences. It's like AERA and MLA and, and the big AAR, those huge conferences, there is a lot of grandstanding and posturing.
Yeah.
It's the thing that I really can't stand. They're good conferences, but I don't like the grandstanding, posturing, and the fights and the meanness sometimes
Yeah.
that I've seen. And I don't know if that's to show. I don't know what it is. I just, you're right. You're absolutely right. All right.
All right.